areas of Reddit for some new material recently, so the following stories are from two new subreddits, Library of Shadows and Short Scary Stories. They don't necessarily all have the same theme. I'm just trying some new material to see what people like. At the end of the video, please leave a comment to let me know what your favourite story was and what kind of stories you would like to hear from me in the future. Story 1. I am writing this because I have no choice. I'd like to say it is a warning to others, but I have far more selfish reasons. Even if I did warn you, I doubt you would heed it, as I did not heed the warning left for me. I must not waste time, as time is wasting me, in a way that defies the medical science I once believed I knew. My joints ache as I write, and soon I know I will be unable to continue. Yet this must be told, and so I write on. I am a doctor here at Rosewood Lodge, and I am 27 years old, though I look older. And by the time you read this, it will be scarcely possible for you to imagine me as I was yesterday. Before me, Rosewood had no resident doctor. This was my first big break, away from the hospital where I trained and qualified. At the interview, I pretty much said I'd work for anything, so they snapped me up. Rosewood is a residential care home for elderly patients, some of whose care needs had started to become more advanced than those which a nursing home can ordinarily provide. The board had decided that, rather than paying out for consultants and continually dealing with emergencies, it made better economic sense to have someone like me on the payroll. It was, in short, an excellent job. Relaxed, but responsible, challenging, but manageable. And the money was good enough for me to get my own flat, finally. The home is essentially 3 stories of self-contained flats divided into 3 wings, A, B, and C on each floor. Some of the residences are less flats and more rooms, without locks and without any real facilities of their own. The nurses and social workers tended to stay away from me, as I was still an outsider to them, and they had the run of the place, working with the residents each day, whereas I would only see them if they were ill. One thing that I did pick up from my colleagues, however, was the strange warning about the man in room 17 on the end of Wing B on the 2nd floor. The ridiculous thing about that particular warning was that the numbers on each wing only went up to 16. The nurses tended to act strangely about it, saying that if ever there was a room 17, I'd be better off not going in. I saw no harm in laughing along with it at the time, and I quickly forgot all about it. Until the day I happened to be in B wing on the 2nd floor and noticed a room I hadn't seen before. I had been at Rosewood for 3 days, and it was late. I'd been tending to a particularly unwell man in a room along the corridor who needed a lot of attention. I was considering referring him to a hospice in the morning, if after I studied his charts I decided they would be better placed to care for him. So I wasn't really in a good frame of mind as I left his room and turned to make my way to the stairs. I don't know if it was my mood or the lateness of the hour, but something made me stop. I felt a tingle at the back of my neck, a creeping sense of something not right. I turned. How I wish I had not. I wish I had kept on, along the brightly lit corridor, down the stairs and back to my office. Instead, I looked back along the hall to where a flickering overhead light cast dark shadows over the far wall, highlighting the steel edges of the window, looking out into the blackness beyond. Glimpsed for moments at a time in that uncertain light was a door that should not have been there. I knew it should not have been there, and I did recall the warning, but truthfully, I was too intrigued and too steadfast in my belief in science and rationality to ignore it. I approached it, curiosity overcoming my incredulity. I did not feel even the faintest stirrings of fear until my fingers touched the handle beneath the elegantly carved number 17. It was deathly cold, and I pulled my hand back with trepidation. Cursing myself for a foolish child and beginning to believe it was some kind of prank by the nursing staff, I glanced up at the ceiling, half expecting to see a camera propped up somewhere. The thought that perhaps I was being made a fool steeled my resolve, and wrapping my hand in my sleeve, I opened the door. For a moment, I was stunned, It was one thing to make a prank door, quite another to make it open. And beyond lay a room that I knew had not existed an hour before. Inside was a residential room like any other, a small kitchenette along one wall to the right, next to a door to a small bathroom, a coffee table, and a TV along the left. A bed stretched along the far wall beneath the large windows, and a sofa sat facing the TV. Poking out above the sofa, I could just see the top of an old man's head, wisps of grey hair draped across the leather. I should have run. I should have quit. I should have obeyed those instincts which keep us all sane and alive. But I'd made a lifetime out of understanding and reason, and I was determined to find out what was happening. I approached the old man, the scent of old medicine and unwashed bodies thick in the air. I had the impression that he had not been disturbed for a very long time. Only a faint, wheezing rasp indicated that he was breathing. Milky blue eyes widened into a withered and lined face as I came into view, and the old man's fingers, resting against the leather chair's arms, twitched slightly. His mouth moved a little, and his breathing became a rattle, as though he was trying to speak. I had the impression that he was agitated, by my presence or by something else I could not tell, but he was also powerless to move. I sat down on the footstool by his chair, running through diagnoses in my head as I took in the pallor of his skin, the thin cracked lips, the struggling fingers. He seemed to be dehydrated, weak and wasted through muscle atrophy, and yet he was clothed and appeared to have not soiled himself. Someone must have been looking after him then. Perhaps one of the nurses? Had they been keeping him here, a secret only revealed by some accident? The man's eyes drifted to a book lying on the coffee table and seized upon it, glancing back to me only in short, furtive motions. Intuiting that he wanted it, I picked it up. A thin leathery tome with the date 1916 written upon it in spidery letters, and placed it on his knees. He stared at me, back at the book, then at me. So I picked it up again and turned to the last entry of what was clearly a diary. April 25th, 1916. I read aloud, somewhat astonished that it was the same date as today, only 100 years before. The old man stared at me through wide eyes. I continued to read. My joints seize with pain. There is no hope for me. The doors of this infernal building were locked fast against me when I tried to flee. The corridors, guarded by spectres I dare not name. My only retreat is here. This impossible room that should not be. With every step I felt my body crippled further, and I had no choice but to sit. Yet now I cannot rise from my chair. My fingers can barely hold this pen. I feel age embracing me like an unwanted lover, taking years from me with each passing second. The words on the page became illegible, the scratching of the pen a testament to the writer's pain. Further down the page they rallied, large letters in capital letters, marching across the page as though in defiance of his pending immobility. The silent man is gone. I am his replacement. Time is short. God, forgive me. I rose from the stool, my heart thumping wildly within my chest. I stumbled and almost fell over the stool as I moved away from the silent man, my thoughts a jumble of half-finished fears. The wide eyes watched me still, but now I saw something else within them, some kind of grim hope, an expectation, and I feared I knew for what. All my belief in science and medicine, rationality and reason flew from me, carried away on wings of pure terror. Without another thought, I fled the room, glad beyond words when the door yielded, leading me back into the corridor beneath the flickering light. I ran for the stairs, frantically making for the comforts of my office, my computer, my life beyond this impossibility. I stopped short as I rounded the corner. Before me, at the end of the corridor, stood an old woman. She was in a dirty white hospital robe. She was hunched over to such a degree that her head was hidden beneath a long mop of lank grey hair, reaching almost to the ground. In one wrinkled hand she clutched the metal pole of her IV, standing like a banner-bearer on an ancient battlefield. As I saw her, I knew we had no such patient in Rosewood. Behind her, the remainder of the corridor was plunged into darkness as the overhead light went out. The light above the woman flickered on and off, and she shuffled a little, with an awkward motion as though agitated or freed by the shadows playing over her. The light went out. Instantly, she was in front of me, at the edge of illumination cast by the light above my head, as though existing only in that dark place beyond. A fetid stench of wet clothes and mouldy cheese radiated from the woman, and I recoiled violently, as much from her smell as her sudden impossible appearance. The light above me flickered. I turned and ran, mortal peril lending me speed. I tried the door to the left, but it was locked. I tried the right, locked. The woman behind me uttered a hideous gurgling sound as the light above her died, instantly bringing her a few more meters towards me. I kept running, but was suddenly aware of an ache in my limbs. It was harder to breathe than it should have been, and I stumbled as I ran. Before long, I was driven back to this impossible room where I discovered that, as I feared, the old man had vanished. I shouted, I screamed, but slowly the atrophy stole over me as I knew it would. The pain of arthritis grew like fire in my bones, the agony of movement as tiring as the movement itself. I couldn't resist, and I lowered my exhausted body into this chair, where I now sit. I have typed these words with the last strength I have, and soon I must succumb. But I must do something before I fall back into the stupor that awaits me, as it did my predecessor. To speed my release, I must upload my story to anywhere a reader may find them across the internet. My fingers burn with unnatural pain as I work my phone, but my desperation gives me the strength to ignore it, along with any guilt I might feel at passing on this curse. And so, to you who read this, I thank you. The next ache you feel will be the start of your sentence, and the end of mine. Story 2. Nobody knows why we sleep, or why we dream. There are a number of possible explanations, ideas, and theories, but no one knows for sure. I would prefer it to stay that way because after the way things played out in front of me, I would rather not know. When I was 17, my sister died. She was 15. She was the lovable, sweet country girl type, and a violin prodigy at that. She could replicate any melody from almost any instrument on her violin after hearing it only once. I remember her showing me that just a few days before she got hit by a bus on her way to school. The investigation concluded that it was nobody's fault. She followed all the rules, as did the bus driver, but the frozen road made it impossible to slow the vehicle in time. Her body was cut in half, and her gut spread out over several meters of asphalt until the torso was crushed against a tree. I don't know how much she felt of what happened. Everyone goes through the grieving process differently, but to me the overwhelmingly largest feeling to come from all of this was guilt. I realized much later I shouldn't be so hard on myself. I wasn't even there that day, so it's not like I could have saved her. But that wasn't really it. Our society really has no reassuring way of dealing with death and dying. I felt more guilty about how other people perceived my grieving than I felt about anything I did in relation to my sister. I felt guilty about how I treated my mother, my extended family, and I felt guilty about how I replied to people when they asked how I was doing. And I think that was my biggest mistake. Many people completely stopped hanging out with me in the wake of what happened, and those who stayed wanted to take me shopping, travelling, or even sleep with me to try and help me forget about the horrible thing that happened. That was impossible, of course. No matter how much I played along, the things that became clear to me was that people simply didn't want to deal with death. Not that I blame them. I certainly didn't want to, but I had to do it. Pretending it wasn't there was not going to be the answer. Regardless, time had its way with me whether I liked it or not. I went through high school, university, and travelled the world wherever I could. The sorrow became a part of me, and eventually I couldn't really feel a difference. But there was one very tangible difference that reminded me of it several nights a month. I would dream about her, in different situations, and in those dreams, even though she was 15 when she died, she had aged accordingly. We did things that siblings growing up would do together. It was as if she was just living in a different city, really, and I got to meet her every now and then. Fairly often, I would say, just like my friends at university did with their relatives. It wasn't a reassuring concept, though, because it wasn't real. The reminder of what could have been made the horror of her passing all too real every time it happened. But once again, I got used to this. It took me years before I realized that these dreams would not stop with time. The worst part, however, wasn't the dreams in and of themselves. It was that not all of them were pleasant even as they were happening. There would be dreams where we would be in trouble, nightmares that we had faced together. There were dreams where she would scream at me and even hit me. Then, of course, there were dreams we had sexual relations with each other. Holy hell, I feel sick just thinking about it. Was I mentally ill? Was I torturing myself, or was she? If so, why? It has made me feel less human. What was the point of that? The next chapter in my life came when I met Josephine. It was during my 3rd year of university, and we had ended up with almost identical schedules. I don't think I would ever have talked to her otherwise. She was timid, but sure of herself. Trusting people didn't come easy to her, but she valued close relationships, and she was brilliant. She came from a large, wealthy family in Stockholm, and a Christian one at that, which is not at all that common in this country. Being a mother was what she looked forward to above all else, and in a way you could tell just by looking at her. Wide hips, a large bosom, and always modestly dressed. She was mature in all the good ways that we'd associate with motherhood. I, on the other hand, wanted little to do with family life. I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere in our society. Sitting alone reading about philosophical pessimism and listening to black metal felt way more in line with who I was compared to whatever normal people were doing. I still wasn't sure that life as a whole was worth living, much less continuing it in the form of procreation. Time wasn't done with me, though. Evidently, I had growing up to do. Josephine more or less forced me to get rid of the dark thoughts and influences, but being with her felt right. What else was I looking for? The answer was that I'd stopped looking. I wasn't thinking any longer. I didn't need to question or justify being happy during those years with her. Happiness is its own justification, not at all like sorrow, even less so considering that happiness actually went away. It faded, where sorrow did not. We graduated and got well-paying jobs, got a real nice apartment, got married. I remember thinking that being sad isn't really the opposite of being happy. The adversary of happiness is boredom. I was living in Josephine's world now, not just of upper-class Stockholm, a world ruled by social media, fashion, restaurants, weekend trips to London, and summer nights out on the scoreboard. But also one where trouble was distant and purpose never really contemplated. Stressful and boring at the same time. I felt comfortable with her, not much else, but I just let it happen. Our beautiful baby girl Molly was born a year or so after marriage. It wasn't entirely intentional, but with getting so sloppy with contraceptives, what did we expect? Josephine, of course, was taken aback but eventually overjoyed. I didn't like what happened at first, but with much else in my life, I just let it happen. In any case, any doubt was removed the day she was born. The feeling was overwhelming. Like, I'm responsible for this little person. Is this really me? Something changed inside of me. I wasn't used to it, but I saw a different kind of future, a bright future. I never thought I'd be the type. But things fell apart. We had a daughter together. And then we didn't. She was 4 months old when we went to visit my in-laws one afternoon in the very early spring. The snow had begun to thaw. We'd left Molly sleeping in the stroller out on the veranda while we had coffee indoors. Afterwards, I went out to check up on her. Panic. That was a new one. Real panic. Panic that gradually gives way to complete desperation even in a very short time frame, as if the temperature in your blood drops while all sound is blocked out by your heart beating in your ear. A huge chunk of it must have fallen down on her from the roof at some point while we were inside. Snow fell off all the time, so it doesn't really matter if we'd heard it or not. It would have been no way to tell when. Clearly long enough for her to suffocate to death, though. Josephine could see my reaction from the window, and she ran out. I had already dug out Molly's lifeless body from the snow by then. Josephine's scream hurt my left ear. Her parents rushed out as well, but they were at a loss for what to do. I saw my wife's face, red, and cracked open by a gaping, screaming mouth and full of tears. Then everything fell into place for me. The same emotions I had when I was 17 came into my life again. Now it was I who was comfortable in my own world, and everyone I knew that wasn't. Just like all those years ago, no one knew what to do, and they didn't really bother trying to tell the truth. No one in my wife's family knew what to do. My family didn't want to go through with it again. So, it was just me and my wife. I was thinking that had I been on my own, I could have made it through. I might have been fine, or at least back to normal. But Josephine complicated things. There was very little left of her. The muscles in her face visibly reshaped themselves due to crying, stress, and lack of sleep. Her posture fell apart, and her body language wasn't there anymore. She'd say or do nothing, except for when she screamed at me about how she resented the life I'd given her, and when she had panic attacks late at night and needed me to caress her and calm her down. My own nightmares got worse too. One night, I was laying next to her and saw her lower body covered in bugs, maggots, beetles, humongous centipedes crawling all over her with gangrene and fungal infections spreading. I'd never been so frightened in all my life, and my screaming woke her up. I now stood at a point where her emotional state and my emotional state made us feel worse. We couldn't split up. We both knew that. Or I knew it anyway. She didn't have much of a will of her own anymore. I decided to make a radical decision to move, at least temporarily. My grandmother had a cabin deep into the forests in the north, which was technically mine by now. I took my wife there to keep her away from the stress of everyday life, and I think I made the right decision. The quiet and the fresh air did make her sleep better. Doing menial tasks like chopping wood and cooking meals with our very limited kitchen, bringing water from a well, etc., did her good. And whatever did her good, did me good. It just didn't last. After one particularly bad night of us fighting about something her sister had said at our daughter's funeral, which we hadn't really reflected on before, that went from Josephine being angry at her sister to being angry at me, and culminating in screaming that I deserved everything bad that had ever happened to me, to then realizing what that entailed, choking up and collapsing on the floor, begging for forgiveness. Of course I forgave her, but seeing her like that was eating away at me. That night, we were laying in bed together, my wife sleeping next to me. I saw someone walking into the room and standing at the end of the bed. In the dim candlelight, I could make out that it was my sister. She was a fully grown woman at this point, and she was carrying something. She was carrying my daughter, Molly. What happened next I will never forget for the rest of my life. My sister opened her mouth, bent down, and took a huge bite of the baby in her arms. When she looked up, her face had transformed. No eyes, just dried up grey sockets. Lips seemed to have been torn away and only a large grin, much larger than a real human grin, full of rotting teeth with maggots, baby flesh and blood sticking out between them showed. When I woke up, Josephine was not beside me, and the sun had been up for a long time. Not that it meant much in this part of the country at this time of year. I laid down to calm myself, but I realized what a bad idea that was. Falling back asleep after a nightmare was a guaranteed way of having another hour of sleep paralysis. I got up, and I got dressed. I noticed that Josephine's long black coat was missing, so I figured she must be outside. I stopped to gather myself a little. There was some kind of change today. Things had reached a peak tonight. Somehow, I could feel it. I walked out of the front door and onto the steps while expecting my wife in the front yard. The location of the cabin was very special. Deep in the forest but up on a mountain, with a large yard around it. On a clear day, you could see very far, and it almost always was. The forest covered a rolling landscape with mists passing between the mountains. It was where Scandinavian folklore was born. The place made you think of trolls and runes and old dancing rituals celebrating fertility. I would see Josephine standing there, right in front of the cabin, looking out over all of it. She turned back at me, with her long blonde hair waving lightly in the wind, and smiled. For the first time in many months, I would see her smile. Of course, I didn't. She wasn't there, and nowhere to be seen. I was sure she'd be back soon. She wasn't, though. The police found her 2 days later. They dragged her body out of the river, bloated, her swollen tongue on the verge of bursting through her mouth, and with her eyes popping out of their sockets with tiny black holes in the middle, the iris barely visible. Was it an accident or suicide? They asked me what I thought. I didn't answer because why should I? They understood and stopped asking. Gave me a ride back home to the city. So now I was finally on my own again. My grief was mine, and mine alone. I didn't talk much to anyone I knew at first, but things did slowly crawl back to normal. I still had my job and my apartment. If people met me in the street, I would even smile and laugh as we were talking. They would think I looked like I'd recover. But of course I wouldn't. But that's not what they cared about. I knew that they really understood. There was nothing left for me to go back to. All that I had lost and all I felt was nowhere to be seen for anyone. And for me, there was nothing else. Only the same constant pain. All the emotions slowly converged into the same. Guilt. Guilt over having failed as a brother, father, and husband. Guilt over not treating people around me right and forcing sorrow upon them simply by existing next to them. It was all the same, and it would always be the same. There was never any hope of me getting over it. Even if I did forget about it, I would be reminded of it that very same night. That night I would find myself in the cabin, with all 3 of them there, in dim candlelight. They would all look at me with the same hollow, rotten, grey, inhuman grin. All of them, including Molly. Story 3. The following story is told from the perspective of a female. Ben, a childhood buddy of my boyfriend Phil, turned 21 and threw a party in the rural part of Wales where they both lived until Phil moved away to attend university. I'd never met most of the guests before, but everyone seemed nice, except perhaps for an older bloke named Andy. We played a fun game of 2 lies, 1 truth, where people reveal a shocking true secret, along with 2 lies, and everyone else has to guess which of the 3 tales isn't fictional. It's usually pretty obvious when someone is lying. One guy claimed to have played the baby in the movie Labyrinth, but the fibbing idiot was far too young. Andy's 3 stories all sounded true. Maybe he was just a great storyteller. Maybe not. He told his stories calmly, with a straight face. As a young boy, I climbed a steep rocky path from a secluded beach, where I met a lady in a wheelchair struggling along. So, I started pushing her. But her wheelchair was stubborn, like an overloaded shopping cart. She clipped a rock, spun around, and hurtled back down to the beach. There, she fell out, onto the small spit of sand, screaming about the incoming tide. I panicked and ran home, scared I'd get into trouble if I told anyone. Not long afterwards, I was playing in some sand dunes when I found a beautiful green snake. I'd never seen one before, so I took it home, though it tried to writhe from my grasp all the way. It was too slippery, though, and eventually escaped, slithering off onto a neighbour's lawn. I was too stupid to know that it was a deadly adder. Another day I was playing in an old abandoned farm, full of rusty machinery and random junk. Some kids arrived and started playing hide and seek, but wouldn't let me join in. One girl asked me if I'd spotted anywhere good to hide. I suggested that she climb inside an ancient refrigerator, where no one would even find her. I even helped firmly close the door. I wandered off, too young to appreciate that old refrigerators are death traps. I'm 40 now. These 3 things happened during my idyllic childhood here in Wales, where later I met my colleague and buddy, Ben. Though there were gasps of shock, everyone loved Andy's stories, apart from Phil, who gripped my hand throughout. He'd gone deathly pale, and his voice trembled when he guessed that the second tale was true. Andy clapped and laughed, and there were several sighs of relief that no one had been abandoned on a beach or in a refrigerator. "How did you know?" Andy asked. "Because my mum used a wheelchair until she drowned on a beach when I left to fetch ice cream," said Phil coldly. "And my big sister suffocated in a refrigerator on an abandoned farm. But not when you were a young boy. That's the lie. And you remind me of a creepy guy that was hanging around on both days." Thank you for listening to and/or watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and hit the like button. If you don't currently subscribe to my channel, please do so. It really helps the channel to grow. If you enjoy listening to my narrations, please check out the audiobook I narrated last year, Punch by J.R. Park, available on iTunes and Audible. I've included links also in the description below. Until next time, thanks again for listening.